The windshield wipers lost the argument around mile marker 14. Snow didn't fall on that road so much as it arrived in sheets. Horizontal, furious. Packing against the glass faster than two rubber blades could negotiate. I was driving the lead vehicle, a 12-passenger resort shuttle van with bald tires and a defroster that wheezed like an asthmatic uncle. And I remember the exact moment I understood we were not getting back down tonight. Not because of the snow, because of the bridge. My name is René Chasson. I was 34, lead ski patroller at Spruce Knob Mountain Resort in the high Alleghenies of West Virginia. And I'd been on this access road in bad weather more times than I could count. I knew every switchback, every drainage culvert, every guardrail gap where the mountain dropped 200 feet into Smokehole Canyon. What I didn't know, what none of us knew at 6:15 that evening, was that the Category 4 blizzard screaming across the Appalachian spine was the least dangerous thing climbing the mountain behind us. There were 23 of us. I need you to hold that number. The resort had closed for the season 2 weeks early. Owner's decision, financial, not weather-related. Marcus Harwell, the general manager, had given the staff until Friday to clear out personal property and winterize the remaining systems. Most people came up Thursday afternoon in a loose caravan. Myself, Marcus, two lift mechanics named Bao Nguyen and Terrence Collier, head of housekeeping Diane Ostrowski, and her 17-year-old son Kyle, the resort's part-time EMT Neil Parson, food and beverage manager Celeste Moreau, and a handful of seasonal workers whose names I'll give you when they matter. 23 souls packed into 3 vehicles grinding up a 9-mile mountain road while the weather service screamed warnings we'd stop checking. I had my avalanche pack in the back seat. Probe, shovel, transceiver, first aid kit. Standard carry for someone whose entire professional existence was built around one premise. The mountain is always trying to kill someone, and your job is to get there first. I was good at it. I want you to understand that clearly, because what happened over the next 9 days tested every edge of that identity, and some edges broke. We reached Cutter's Bridge at 6:40. Cutter's Bridge is a single-lane steel truss spanning a 90-foot gap where Gandy Creek cuts through a limestone gorge. It's the only road access to the resort. No bridge, no mountain. I stopped the van, got out, and walked 30 feet into a wind that wanted to peel my face. The bridge deck was buried under 2 feet of compacted snow, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was the 18-wheeler jackknifed across the far approach. Its cab hung at a 30-degree angle off the eastern guardrail, trailer twisted perpendicular, blocking both lane and shoulder. The driver's door was open. Snow had filled the cab to the seat line. No driver. I walked closer. The trailer's rear doors were breached, hinges sheared clean, and the cargo bay was empty, except for a smell I didn't recognize then, but would come to know with sickening intimacy over the next week. Sweet, biological, wrong. I radioed Marcus in the second vehicle. Bridge is blocked. Trucks abandoned. We're not crossing tonight. His response was calm, practical, the voice of a man who'd managed this resort through ice storms and power outages for 11 years. Then we go up. Lodge is heated, generators full. There's enough in dry storage to feed 50 people for a month. We ride it out. That was the decision. Not dramatic, not weighted with foreshadowing in the moment, just logistics. The bridge was impassable, the storm was worsening, and the lodge was warm. We turned the vehicles around and drove the remaining 3 miles to the summit. I did not know the truck had come from a federal quarantine perimeter 60 miles south. I did not know its cargo had been alive 12 hours earlier. I did not know that by blocking the bridge, that truck had done something I would have done myself if I'd understood what was coming. It cut the only road. The mountain was sealed. We just didn't know yet whether we were locked in or locked out. 23 people. Hold that number. By the end, you'll need to count what's left. Spruce Knob Mountain Resort was built in 1987 by a coal money family who wanted a ski destination to compete with Snowshoe. They failed. The mountain was too remote, the vertical drop too modest, the access road too punishing for casual tourists. What they did build, before bankruptcy transferred ownership 3 times, was a lodge designed to survive Appalachian winters at 4,700 feet. Timber frame construction, poured concrete foundation over bedrock. A commercial kitchen, 2 dining halls, a lobby the size of a basketball court with a stone fireplace you could park a truck inside, and 46 guest rooms across 3 floors connected by exterior walkways that wrapped the building like a wooden exoskeleton. The whole structure sat on the summit's western shoulder, backed against a granite ridgeline, facing downslope toward the access road and the tree line, 400 yards below. I'd worked there 7 seasons. I knew every fire exit, every storage closet, every roof access hatch. The building was my professional territory in ways that went beyond employment. When someone broke a femur on the Black Diamond Run or a teenager went hypothermic on the backside bowls, the lodge was where I brought them. It was a medical staging area in my mind, a place of intervention. That mental architecture would matter later. We pulled the 3 vehicles into the covered loading bay behind the kitchen at 7:20. The snow was falling at 3 inches per hour, wind sustained at 40 miles per hour with gusts hitting 60. Wind chill put the summit at -20. Celeste Moreau opened the kitchen service entrance with her master key. And 23 cold, irritated people filed into a building none of them had expected to sleep in that night. Marcus took command the way he always did, without asking, without posturing, just by being the first person to start solving problems. Celeste, inventory dry storage. Bow, Terrence, get the backup generator on standby in case the main line drops. Diane, pick a floor for rooms. Nothing above second, I want everyone consolidated. Neil, medical kit check. He looked at me last. Renee, external assessment. I want to know every way in and out of this building. I nodded. That was my language. Perimeter, exposure, terrain. I grabbed my avalanche pack and a headlamp and went out into the storm. The exterior walkways on the north and east sides were already drifted shut. Good. Fewer entry points to monitor, though I wasn't thinking about entry points in a security sense yet. I was thinking about evacuation routes, fire egress, the standard patroller calculus of how to get hurt people out quickly. I counted doors, 11 exterior doors total, main lobby entrance, kitchen service entrance, 4 stairwell exits on the ground level, 2 emergency exits on the 2nd floor connecting to the walkway, a maintenance access in the basement, the loading bay roll-up door, and a rooftop hatch above the elevator shaft. The lobby entrance had a glass curtain wall beautiful for aesthetics, catastrophic for insulation, and as I would later understand, functionally indefensible. I came back inside and found Marcus in the lobby. He'd already started a fire in the main hearth. Diane had assigned rooms on the 2nd floor, East Wing. Celeste reported dry storage held roughly 3 weeks of staple food for our group size: rice, pasta, canned vegetables, bulk flour, industrial quantity coffee, powdered milk. The freezer walk-in had been emptied during closing procedures, but the dry goods were substantial. Neil confirmed a well-stocked first aid station plus the resort's emergency medical supplies: splints, cervical collars, a portable oxygen tank, basic surgical kit, and enough ibuprofen to medicate a small army. No antibiotics, no IV supplies. None of us turned on a television. The resort satellite package had been disconnected during closure. Cell service at the summit was non-existent in clear weather and laughable in a blizzard. We had 2 handheld radios on resort frequency, a weather band receiver, and a landline phone in the front office that drew its signal through a cable buried along the access road. Marcus tried the landline first. Dead. Storm had probably taken the cable somewhere below Cutter's Bridge. We were isolated. Comfortably, we thought. I sat by the fire that night and listened to the wind scream against the glass curtain wall, and felt something I mistook for annoyance, but was probably the first faint signal of instinct. The mountain sounded wrong. Not the wind. I knew wind. Something underneath it. A vibration in the timber frame. A subsonic hum that could have been structural settling, or could have been the sound of something I had no category for yet. I told myself it was the storm. I went to bed. The weather band receiver woke me at 4:11 in the morning. Not because someone turned it on, it had been cycling through NOAA channels all night in the lobby, volume low, a background murmur nobody was monitoring. What woke me was the silence. The broadcast had been replaced by an emergency alert system tone. That 3-note digital screech designed to bypass sleep and grab the brainstem. I was down the stairs and into the lobby in 60 seconds. Barefoot on cold timber, headlamp on. Marcus was already there. So was Neil Parson. The EAS tone cycled twice more. Then a synthesized voice delivered a message that sounded wrong in a way I couldn't immediately place. It was not a weather advisory. It was not a missing child alert. The classification code was one I'd never heard in 7 years of listening to weather band in a mountain environment. Civil Authority Emergency. The voice instructed residents in Pendleton, Randolph, Pocahontas, and Grant counties to shelter in place. Do not travel. Do not approach individuals exhibiting erratic physical behavior. Avoid contact with bodily fluids. Await further instruction from National Guard elements. The message repeated. Then the tone again. Then the message. Looping. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Neil. Neil was a 51-year-old part-time EMT who drove an ambulance for the county 2 days a week and patched up ski injuries at the resort the other 5. He was not a man who frightened easily. His face, in the blue-white glow of the receiver, was doing something I'd never seen it do. Bodily fluids, he said. That's a contagion advisory. Could be chemical spill, Marcus said. Train derailment. We had that scare in 2019. Chemical spill doesn't say erratic physical behavior. Neil sat down on the stone hearth. Chemical spill says respiratory protection. This is biological. We listened to the loop 4 more times. No additional information. No named pathogen. No estimated duration. Just shelter, avoid, wait. The broadcast was meant for the valleys, the towns, the populated corridors along routes 33 and 220. It was not designed for 23 people already trapped at altitude by a blizzard. We were sheltered by default. The question was what we were sheltering from. Bao Nguyen came down at 5. He'd heard the tone from his room. Bao was 28, born in Martinsburg. Trained as an electrician before pivoting to lift mechanics, and possessed the specific calm of a person who understood systems. Generators running clean, he said, answering a question nobody had asked yet. I topped both tanks yesterday during winterization. 96 hours on the main, 40 on the backup. If we reduce load cut heating to unused wings, kill exterior lighting, I can stretch main to 140, maybe 150 hours. That was 6 days. I did the math silently, then out loud for Marcus. Storms forecast to blow for 2 more days minimum. Even if it stops Saturday, the access road won't be passable for plows until Monday at the earliest. Cutter's Bridge is still blocked by that truck. So we're here through Monday regardless, Marcus said. Through Monday at minimum. He absorbed this. Then, wake everyone at 7. Breakfast meeting. Full transparency. I respected that decision and told him so. Some leaders in crisis default to information control, parse out the scary parts, manage the herd. Marcus chose disclosure. It would cost him later, but that morning it was the right call. At 7:15, 23 people sat in the main dining hall eating powdered egg scramble and canned fruit, while Marcus read the EAS advisory verbatim. And I outlined our logistical position: food for 3 weeks, generator fuel for 6 days on conservation protocol, water from snowmelt and the building's internal tank, no communications, no road access, no timeline for rescue. Diane Ostrowski's son Kyle, 17, raised his hand like he was in a classroom. What does erratic physical behavior mean? Nobody answered. The silence was specific, not confused, not dismissive, but the silence of 22 adults who understood exactly what it might mean, and were not yet willing to say it out loud in front of a teenager. Terrence Collier, the other lift mechanic, broke it. He was 43, built like a load-bearing wall, and spoke rarely. Means we keep the doors locked and we don't go outside unless Renee or Marcus says so. I watched 23 faces absorb this new reality. Some nodded. Some stared at their plates. A seasonal worker named Jess Hartley, 22, who'd worked the rental shop for 2 winters, started crying silently. Another seasonal worker, Derek Fenn, put his arm around her shoulders. We didn't know what was below us. We didn't know the bridge was a blessing. We were afraid of the wrong thing: the storm, the cold, the isolation. The actual threat was still 2 days away from the tree line, moving uphill through snow that should have stopped it, driven by a biology that didn't care about temperature or terrain, or the confident calculations of a ski patroller who thought she understood what mountains could do to a human body. I was wrong about that. Profoundly, catastrophically wrong. The first full day trapped in the lodge passed the way isolation always does when the group hasn't been broken yet cooperatively, with small frictions generating more heat than light. Marcus organized work details. Bao and Terrence began a systematic audit of the building's mechanical systems. Celeste and 2 seasonal workers took full inventory of every edible item in the facility, including the forgotten cache of protein bars in the rental shop's back office and a case of emergency rations in my patroller's closet that I'd stockpiled over 3 seasons. Diane converted the second-floor east wing into organized living quarters, doubling rooms where possible to reduce the heating footprint. I did what I was trained to do. I went outside. Ski Patrol operates in conditions that would shut down every other department. That's not bravery, it's acclimation. My body understood -20 wind chill the way a diver's body understands pressure at depth. I suited up in full storm gear insulated shell, balaclava, goggles, crampons over my boots, and spent 4 hours conducting a perimeter survey of the lodge and the immediate summit area. Visibility was 40 feet. The wind had sculpted the snow into surreal formations, cornices hanging off the roof line, drifts burying the ground floor windows on the north side to within a foot of the sills. The access road below the lodge was gone, erased, a smooth white slope where a road had been. I kicked steps down to the first switchback and confirmed what I expected. No vehicle was moving on that grade until heavy equipment cleared it. I circled the building. The exterior walkways were buried. All ground-level doors except the kitchen service entrance and the main lobby were effectively sealed by snow, which I noted with professional satisfaction. Fewer openings meant less heat loss. I hadn't yet made the cognitive leap to fewer openings means fewer breaches. But the tactical geometry was already assembling itself in a part of my brain I didn't yet have access to. What I found on the south side of the building changed the day. There was a maintenance shed, detached, about 80 feet from the lodge's southern wall. I knew this shed. It housed the resort's snowmaking equipment, spare parts for the lifts, and a small welding station Terrence used for fabrication work. What I didn't know, because it had been added after the resort's closure was announced, was what was leaning against the shed's interior wall. 5 military pattern transit cases, olive drab, no markings, padlocked. I radioed Marcus. He came out with Terrence. The three of us stood in the shed, staring at cases none of us had authorized, and none of us could explain. Terrence had bolt cutters. Marcus hesitated for exactly 4 seconds, then nodded. The first case held MRS military meals ready to eat. 48 per case, enough to extend our food supply by weeks. The second held water purification equipment. The third held field medical supplies, antibiotics, suturing kits, IV bags, quick clot, the supplies Neil didn't have. The fourth held thermal blankets, chemical hand warmers, and rain gear in military packaging. The fifth case held a field radio, AN/PRC-152 pattern, with encryption capability, a battery pack, and a laminated card listing frequencies I didn't recognize. "Who put these here?" I said. Marcus shook his head. "Nobody on my staff. I've been GM for 11 years. I would know." Terrence lifted one of the cases by its handle, testing weight distribution. These were staged, recently. Snow hasn't been on them long. Maybe 2-3 days max. He looked at me. Somebody knew this resort was closing and this storm was coming. And they pre-positioned supplies on a mountaintop that was about to be abandoned. The implication landed on all three of us at once. Someone with military logistics access had chosen this summit as a fallback point. Not for us, for themselves. We were squatters in someone else's contingency plan. Marcus made the decision I would have made. Everything goes inside. Radio goes to Bao, he's got the electronics background. Medical goes to Neil. Food goes to Celeste's inventory. We tell everyone. Full transparency. Again. It was the right call. But telling 23 people that unknown military personnel had staged survival supplies at their location before the crisis began did something to the group's psychology that food and warmth could not reverse. It introduced the idea that someone had known, that the advisory on the weather band was not the beginning, that whatever was happening in the valleys had been anticipated by people with resources we didn't have, and information we weren't given. Jess Hartley stopped crying. Derek Fenn started. Bao got the field radio operational by noon the next day. He was methodical, unhurried, the kind of technician who reads every page of a manual before touching a button. He set up the antenna in the third-floor conference room, the highest interior point with a south-facing window, and began scanning the frequencies listed on the laminated card. Most were silent. One was not. The voice was male, clipped, using a call sign structure Bao recognized from his brief time in ROTC. The transmission was not addressed to us. It was a relay between 2 mobile units somewhere south. In the Greenbrier Valley, from the references, coordinating what the speaker called corridor clearance operations. The language was surgical, sanitized. Terms like mobile hostiles and biological vectors and terminal engagement protocols. But underneath the jargon, the meaning was unambiguous. They were killing people. Infected people, presumably. But the distinction blurred in the flat affect of the speaker's voice. Numbers were referenced. 300 neutralized in Lewisburg, 170 in Marlinton, a request for ammunition resupply at a forward operating base near Durban, an acknowledgement that civilian separation was no longer feasible in the southern sector, and that all personnel in the engagement zone should be treated as potential vectors. Bao recorded it on his phone. He played it for Marcus and me in the kitchen, away from the group. The three of us listened twice. Marcus leaned against the prep counter and pressed his palms flat on the stainless steel, as if he needed to feel something solid. All personnel in the engagement zone, he repeated. They're not distinguishing anymore. They may not be able to, I said. If the infection presents with erratic behavior before visible symptoms, a soldier at a checkpoint can't tell who's turning and who's running. So they kill everyone. I didn't answer because the answer was on the recording. Neil Parson was the next person we told, because medical information was medical information, regardless of its source. He listened once, asked Bao to replay the segment about terminal engagement protocols, and then asked the question none of us had formed yet. What's the incubation period? Silence. None of us had heard that in the transmission. Because if they're shooting everyone in the zone, Neil continued, it means the incubation is either very short or asymptomatic long enough to make screening impossible. Either way, we need to know the vector. Airborne? Fluid contact? The advisory said bodily fluids. If that's accurate, we're looking at something that requires direct transmission, which means it's containable. Which means the military response we're hearing is either premature or they've already lost containment in population-dense areas and can't recover. He paused. How far south is Lewisburg from here? 90 miles by road, I said. 50 as the crow flies. And Durban? 30 miles south, maybe 25. Neil absorbed this. Whatever they're clearing is moving north, toward the mountain corridors. This blizzard might be the only thing between it and us. I went outside again that afternoon. I stood on the south-facing deck where guests used to drink overpriced cocoa and watch beginners fall on the bunny slope. And I stared into the white void below the tree line. Visibility was still under 50 feet. The storm hadn't weakened. If anything, the barometric pressure was still dropping on the lobby's decorative weather station. 30 miles south, soldiers were shooting everything that moved. 23 people above me were eating MREs they hadn't expected, sleeping in rooms they hadn't planned to occupy, listening to a radio that told them the world below was being sectored and cleared like a contaminated building. I checked the tree line through my binoculars even though I couldn't see it. Habit, pattern. The patroller's reflex scanned the terrain for what shouldn't be there. I saw nothing. But I felt the mountain differently than I had the day before. Not as a workplace. Not as a terrain feature I'd memorized across 7 seasons of hauling broken bodies through powder and ice. As a position, the word arrived fully formed, military and tactical. A position is a place you hold because the ground gives you an advantage, and you hold it until you can't. I was a ski patroller, not a soldier. But I stood on 4,700 feet of elevation, backed by a granite ridge, facing a single approach up a road buried in 6 feet of snow. And some part of my brain that predated my training, that lived in the animal architecture beneath the professional identity, understood that high ground is high ground, regardless of who's standing on it. I went inside and started drawing maps. Day 3. The storm intensified. Wind gusted to 75 miles per hour overnight, ripping a section of roofing material from the lodge's east wing and exposing the underlying plywood to driven snow. Bao and Terrence spent 3 hours in the pre-dawn darkness with a tarp, ropes, and a vocabulary I won't reproduce, securing a temporary patch. The building groaned. Not metaphorically, timber frame structures under extreme wind load produce sounds that are disturbingly vocal. And the lodge sang a low, shifting chord that vibrated in the chest cavity and kept people from sleeping. I didn't sleep either, but not because of the sound. I was at the conference room window with binoculars and a thermos of coffee, watching the south slope. I had been watching for 6 hours. At 4:20 in the morning, during a brief lull when the wind dropped and the snow thinned to a gauze curtain, I saw movement at the tree line. Let me be precise. The tree line at Spruce Knob Resort sits at roughly 4,000 feet on the south face, about 700 vertical feet below the lodge. In summer, it's a 15-minute hike down a groomed trail. In a blizzard, it's an impassable white wall. What I saw through the momentary clearing was a figure singular, upright, moving laterally along the tree margin, and then 3 more behind it, spaced unevenly, moving in the same direction but without coordination. They weren't walking together. They were walking in parallel, like separate systems drawn along the same magnetic line. I adjusted focus. At that distance, in that light, I could see posture but not faces. The first figure moved with a gait I recognized from 1,000 accident assessments, the stiff, mechanical stride of someone whose proprioception was compromised. An injured skier walks that way. A person with a spinal cord contusion walks that way. A drunk at altitude walks that way. The second figure fell, not tripped, collapsed laterally, as if one leg simply stopped functioning mid-stride. It went down into thigh-deep snow, and then, with a motion I still see when I close my eyes, it stood back up using only its arms. No leg engagement. It planted both hands, pressed itself vertical, and resumed walking on legs that should not have supported it. I keyed the radio. "Marcus, conference room, now." He arrived in 3 minutes, shirt untucked, hair matted. I handed him the binoculars without speaking. The window of visibility was closing as the wind resumed. But he caught the last 10 seconds of the figures before the snow swallowed them. He lowered the binoculars. "How many?" "4 that I saw, moving east along the tree line." "Moving up?" "Not yet. Lateral." "Could be survivors." I took the binoculars back. "Marcus, the way they move." He didn't argue. He'd seen it. The human eye is a pattern-matching machine, and what those figures were doing didn't match any pattern that belongs to an uninjured, cognitively intact person. There's a valley in the recognition process psychologists call it the uncanny valley for faces, but it exists for movement too. When a body moves with the skeletal mechanics of a human, but without the neurological coordination that makes human movement human. Some alarm system deep in the limbic brain starts screaming. And it screams in a frequency you cannot rationalize away. We woke Neil. He came up, looked through the binoculars into the now opaque storm, saw nothing, and listened to what we described. His face did the thing again, the reconfiguration I'd seen when the EAS advisory first played. "South face, moving east," he said. "If they continue east, they'll intersect the access road below the first switchback. The road is the path of least resistance to the summit, even buried." He looked at me. "What's the snow depth on the road right now?" 5 to 6 feet on the exposed sections. Drifts to 12 in the cuts. "Can a human body move through 6 feet of snow?" "A healthy person with snowshoes? Maybe a 1/4 mile per hour. Without snowshoes, in that depth, you're swimming, not walking. It would take hours to cover the road distance. And an unhealthy person? A person who doesn't feel cold, doesn't feel exhaustion, doesn't stop. The question hung in the room like a held breath. I didn't have an answer because the answer required me to accept a premise. I was still resisting. That the figures at the tree line were not survivors fleeing the valley, not hikers caught in the storm, not the military personnel whose supplies we'd found, but something else. Something the EAS advisory had tried to name with its sanitized language and failed, because there is no clinical term that adequately describes a human body operating without a human mind inside it. "They're climbing," I said. The word left my mouth before my conscious mind approved it. "They'll reach the road. The road leads here." I called a meeting at 0600. Full group, no omissions. Marcus stood beside me in the dining hall and let me speak because this was now a terrain problem, and terrain was mine. "There are people at the tree line," I said. "We observed 4 individuals early this morning moving along the south face. Based on what we've monitored on the field radio and the EAS advisory, we believe these individuals are infected. We do not know with what. We do not know the mechanism. We do know they are moving in a pattern consistent with approach, and the access road provides a natural corridor to this building." I let that settle. 21 faces looked back at me. Some were confused, some were afraid. Kyle Ostrowski, sitting beside his mother, looked like he was solving a math problem, brow furrowed, eyes calculating rather than panicking. I noted that. It would matter. "This lodge was not designed as a defensible structure," I continued. "It was designed to be welcoming, which means large glass surfaces, multiple entry points, and ground floor access from every direction. We're going to change that, starting now." Terrence spoke first. "What are we changing it into?" "A position we can hold." The word landed differently when spoken to the full group than it had in my head on the deck. Position implies adversary. It implies combat. 23 resort workers in a ski lodge on a mountaintop, and I was asking them to think like a garrison. Marcus backed me. "Renee has more time on this mountain than anyone alive. If she says we need to prepare, we prepare. Assignments will be voluntary." He paused. "But I'd recommend volunteering." Everyone did. That was day 3. The fractures hadn't started yet. I divided the group into 4 teams. Bao led structural reinforcement. His mandate was to reduce ground floor entry points from 11 to 2. Kitchen service entrance and the main lobby door would remain functional. Everything else was to be barricaded, braced, or buried. He had Terrence, Derek Fenn, and 3 seasonal workers whose construction experience ranged from competent to improvised, but willing. Celeste led logistics, food rationing, water management, fuel conservation. She recalculated our supply window based on the MRE supplement. 26 days of food at reduced portions. Longer if we cut to 1 full meal and 2 supplement meals daily. She didn't present this as deprivation. She presented it as planning, which was the correct frame and bought her cooperation that would have been resistance otherwise. Neil established a medical station in the 2nd floor linen closet, centrally located, defensible by design, 1 door, no windows, thick walls. He organized the military medical supplies alongside the resort's kit and posted a symptom monitoring protocol on the door. Anyone with fever, confusion, disorientation, or unexplained aggression was to report immediately. The word aggression caused a ripple in the group. Nobody asked what it meant. Everyone understood. I kept the 4th team myself, Kyle Ostrowski, and a seasonal worker named Marin Dietrich, who'd been a forestry student before she started working rental counters. Our job was observation. 4-hour rotating watches from the conference room, south-facing, binoculars and radio, logging every visual contact and every intercepted transmission. Kyle asked to be on my team specifically. His mother objected. He overrode her with a sentence that made me reassess his age. "Mom, I'm the only person here who's played enough video games to actually sit still and watch a screen for 4 hours without losing focus." It was self-deprecating, accurate, and delivered with a calm that made Diane close her mouth and nod. Marin Dietrich was quiet, observant, and had the one skill nobody else had brought to the mountain. She could identify terrain features and vegetation patterns from distance with a trained eye. Forestry fieldwork had taught her to read a landscape the way I read a ski slope. And her observations over the coming days would prove more valuable than any piece of equipment in those military cases. We began. Bao's team worked for 14 hours. They stripped furniture from unused rooms, bed frames, desks, dressers, and braced them against ground floor doors and windows. The glass curtain wall in the lobby presented the most serious problem. 40 feet of single-pane glass, beautiful and suicidal. Terrence proposed collapsing the heavy timber display shelving from the gift shop against it as a sacrificial barrier. It wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it would slow penetration and create noise. They stacked it 6 feet deep. By nightfall, the lodge looked like a different building from the inside. Cluttered, barricaded. Dim Bao had killed all non-essential lighting to conserve generator fuel. The warm, open ski lodge atmosphere was gone, replaced by something that felt like a bunker, even though it wasn't one. I didn't use that word. I said hardened shelter. The distinction mattered to me even if it mattered to no one else. Day 4. The storm paused. Not stopped, paused, like a breath between sentences. The clouds thinned enough to let a gray, diffuse light reach the summit, and visibility stretched to 300 yards for the first time since we'd arrived. I was on watch. I had the binoculars. I counted 19. They were on the access road below the second switchback, spread across the road's width and into the tree line on both sides, moving uphill. Their pace was glacial. The snow was chest-deep in the road cuts, and they were plowing through it with that mechanical, unceasing gait I'd seen in the first 4. No coordination, no communication, no clustering. Each one moved independently, drawn by whatever signal or instinct pointed them uphill. And the total effect was less like a group and more like water finding its level, flowing upward along the path of least resistance, toward the highest point. 19. The number was too large to be random. 4 could be a lost group. 19 was a population sample. They were coming from the valley, from Durban, from the communities along Route 33, from wherever the military's corridor clearance operations had missed or pushed this direction. I studied them through the binoculars and cataloged what I saw with the same clinical detachment I used when assessing injuries on the slope. Their clothing was varied: winter coats, jeans, a woman in what appeared to be hospital scrubs. Some were barefoot, feet blackened. And I understood immediately that frostbite was actively destroying tissue that the infected body was ignoring. They were not cold adapted. They were cold indifferent. The snow that should have stopped them, that I had counted on stopping them, was merely slowing them, and not enough. I woke Marcus. He counted them himself. How long until they reached the lodge? I calculated. At current pace, through that snow depth, 12 to 18 hours, but if the storm weakens further and the snow consolidates, faster. Maybe 8. Can we block the road? With what? We'd need heavy equipment or explosives to create a physical barrier on that grade. He looked at me. I looked at the access road switch backing up the south face. And I saw it the way I'd seen it every spring when we assessed avalanche risk for early season operations. The south face of Spruce Knob, above the second switchback, was a classic avalanche terrain trap, a 38-degree slope with a convex rollover, minimal tree anchor above the road, and a deep snowpack that had been loaded by 3 days of sustained wind. In a normal season, I would have closed that slope and marked it with explosives control boundaries. I had, in fact, triggered controlled avalanches on that face 6 times in my career, using hand charges thrown from the ridgeline above. "Marcus," I said, "I can bury the road." He stared at me. "You're talking about setting off an avalanche." "I'm talking about using the terrain. That slope is loaded. 3 days of wind-deposited snow on a weak layer. I can feel it in the way the surface crust fractures when I walk on it. One properly placed explosive charge on the convex rollover above switchback 3 will release a slab that runs the full face. It will deposit 15 to 20 feet of debris across the road below, essentially creating a dam of avalanche cement that nothing is walking through. We don't have explosives. We have the shed. Terrence has a welding station with acetylene. Bao has electrical knowledge. And I have 7 years of avalanche control experience, including 3 certifications in hand charge deployment." I paused. I've never improvised a charge. But the physics are the physics. I need a pressure wave at the fracture point, not a shaped detonation. Acetylene in a sealed container with an ignition source will do it. Marcus was quiet for a long time. The wind was picking up again. The 19 figures below were disappearing into the returning snow. "If you miscalculate," he said, "you bring the slope down on the lodge." The lodge sits on the summit shoulder, above and west of the release zone. The avalanche path runs south-southeast. We're not in it. "You're sure?" "I've mapped that path 40 times, I'm sure." He nodded. Not permission acknowledgement. Marcus understood that this was my mountain, my terrain, my science, and that the authority to make this call lived in my professional identity in a way that his managerial authority could not override. I told Terrence what I needed. He looked at me like I'd asked him to build a spaceship, then spent 4 seconds thinking, and then started pulling equipment. Bao rigged the ignition system, a simple electric match wired to a 100-foot lead with a manual battery contact. Crude, reliable, exactly what I needed. By dusk, I had 3 improvised charges in a backpack, each one a sealed acetylene canister with Bao's ignition wire threaded through a drilled cap. I also had a plan, a route, and the certain knowledge that I was about to either save us or kill us, and that the margin between those outcomes was about 6 degrees of slope angle and 20 feet of lateral position. I told the group at dinner. Full transparency, again. Kyle Ostrowski asked how avalanches work. I told him. Maren Dietrich asked what happens if the charges don't fire. I told her that too. Nobody asked what happens if I fall. They didn't need to. Every person in that dining hall understood that the woman who'd been walking their mountain in -20 wind chill for 4 days was the only person who could do this, and that asking her not to was the same as asking them to wait for 19 bodies to reach the front door. I went out at 3 in the morning on day 5. The storm had not fully returned. It hovered, indecisive, dropping snow at 1 inch per hour with moderate wind. Enough to reduce visibility, but not enough to prevent movement. I carried 3 charges: the detonation wire on a spool, my avalanche pack, crampons, an ice axe, and a headlamp I kept off to preserve my night vision, and because some part of me did not want to be visible from below. The route to the deployment point was one I'd walked in every condition this mountain could produce. West along the ridgeline from the lodge, then south along the crest above the avalanche starting zone. to the convex rollover where the slope angle transitions from 25 to 38 degrees. In summer, it's a 20-minute walk. In 6 feet of snow, in the dark, with 30 pounds of improvised explosives on my back. It took 90 minutes. I want to describe what it felt like to stand on that ridgeline at 4:30 in the morning, alone, with the wind flattening my jacket against my ribs and the snow hissing past my goggles like static on a dead channel. Below me, invisible in the dark, 19 infected people were grinding uphill through snow that would have stopped any rational creature. Above me, 22 people were sleeping in a building I had promised to protect. And beneath my boots, a slab of wind-deposited snow sat on a layer of faceted crystals that I could feel through my crampons, a weak layer, a fracture plane, a loaded weapon that the mountain had assembled from nothing but wind and cold and time. I knew this slope. I had studied its fracture history, probed its layers with an avalanche probe, dug snow pits to analyze its crystal structure. This was not guesswork. This was applied science, performed by a professional at the top of her field, in conditions she'd trained for, on terrain she'd memorized. And my hands were shaking so badly I could barely thread the ignition wire through the charge cap. I placed 3 charges in a line along the convex rollover, spaced 30 feet apart, buried 18 inches deep in the snowpack with the ignition wires running uphill to my position behind a rock outcrop on the ridge crest. The placement was textbook initiate the fracture at the point of maximum tensile stress. Let the slab's own weight do the work. I had done this with commercial explosives 6 times. The only variable was whether acetylene in a sealed container would produce sufficient overpressure to fracture the slab. I unspooled the wire to my position, connected the leads to Bow's battery contact, said something I don't remember what, possibly nothing, possibly a prayer to a God I'd stopped believing in at 22 when my mother died on a ventilator in a hospital that smelled like the sweet biological wrongness I'd caught in that truck cab on the bridge. I closed the contact. The first charge detonated with a sound like a giant clapping once. The second fired a half-second later. The third didn't fire. 2 out of 3 was enough. The fracture propagated faster than I could process a crack that raced across the slope face at the speed of sound, visible as a line in the snow surface even in the dark. Then the slab released. A 100-yard wide section of snowpack, 4 feet deep, broke free from the mountain and began to move. Slowly at first, avalanches always start slow. A deceptive crawl that makes you think you could outrun it, and then with acceleration that turned 100,000 tons of snow into a fluid moving at 70 miles per hour down a 38-degree slope. The sound was not a roar. It was a hiss that became a thunder that became a frequency below, hearing a vibration in the bedrock. In my sternum, in the molten core of a planet that does not care what walks on its surface. The debris cloud rose 200 feet, a white wall that swallowed the road, the switchbacks, the trees below, and everything on them. It ran for 14 seconds. When it stopped, the south face of Spruce Knob was transformed. A debris field of avalanche concrete snow compressed by its own violence into a density approaching ice. Buried the access road under an estimated 20 feet of material across a front 300 yards wide. Nothing was crossing that. Not a vehicle, not a person, not 19 infected bodies that had been somewhere in that path when the mountain came down on them. I sat behind my rock outcrop and shook for 10 minutes. Then I wound up the wire, checked the unexploded third charge, and found its ignition wire had severed during burial, secured it, and walked back to the lodge. Marcus met me at the kitchen door. He'd heard it. Everyone had heard it. He looked at my face and didn't ask if it worked. South face is closed, I said. The ski patrol terminology came out automatically, the phrase I'd radioed 100 times after a successful control shot. It had never meant what it meant now. The avalanche bought us silence for 3 days. The south face was impassable. The storm returned with renewed fury on day 5. And the combination of terrain modification and weather created a buffer that allowed the lodge to function as something approaching normal. People ate. People slept. Bao managed the generator with a miser's precision, coaxing extra hours from conservation measures that bordered on obsessive attention, the heating cycles to align with sleep schedules, running the kitchen equipment in batches, killing every phantom load in the building. Terrence reinforced the roof patch. Neil conducted daily medical checks with the quiet authority of a man who understood that the act of examination was itself therapeutic. That being looked at by a professional tells the body it matters. I maintained the watch. Marin and Kyle rotated with me. For 3 days, we saw nothing on the south face except the massive debris field and the ongoing snowfall burying it deeper. On day 6, Marin saw them on the east ridge. She called me to the window at midday, her voice flat and controlled in a way that told me she'd already processed what she was looking at. I took the binoculars. 3 figures on the exposed granite above the tree line, east of the lodge, moving along the ridge toward the summit. They were not on the road. They were not following any trail. They had come up the mountain's flank, through forest and rock and snow, ignoring every feature of terrain that should have funneled them to a passable route. "They're not using the road," Marin said. No. The avalanche didn't matter. I lowered the binoculars. She was right, and the implications restructured everything I'd built. The avalanche had closed one route, the easiest route, the logical route. The route I'd assumed was the only route because I was thinking like a patroller managing terrain. But the infected were not thinking at all. They didn't assess grade or route efficiency. They moved toward the signal along whatever ground their bodies could traverse, and the mountain had more than one way up. I counted approach vectors: south face, buried, impassable; east ridge, exposed granite with minimal snow, climbable by anything with functional limbs; north face, steep, heavily forested, deep snow but not vertical; west approach, the backside bowls, gentler grade, accessible from the adjacent valley over a saddle at 4,000 feet. I'd been watching south. The threat was coming from everywhere. "Kyle," I said, "I need eyes on every face. North window in the equipment room. West window in room 214. You take east, Marin takes west. I'll rotate between south and north." "There's only 3 of us," Kyle said. "I know." This was the first time I felt the mathematics of our situation as a physical sensation, a tightening in the chest that wasn't fear, but the recognition of insufficiency. 23 people, 11 of whom were performing essential functions, 3 on watch, and the remaining 9 either physically limited, emotionally compromised, or both. The mountain had 360 degrees of perimeter, and I had 3 pairs of binoculars. I went to Marcus. The avalanche slowed them on the south face. They're coming up the east ridge now. There will be more from other directions. We need to expand the watch, and we need contingency planning for breach. Marcus had been steady for 6 days, rock consistent. But I watched something shift behind his eyes when I said breach, a recalculation of what this situation actually was versus what he'd been managing it as. He'd been running a shelter operation, logistics, morale, resource management. I was asking him to run a defensive position. "What do you need?" he said. "More watchers. A communication system between observation posts. Bow can rig intercoms from the room phones if the internal PBX is still functional. And I need a fallback plan. If the ground floor is compromised, where do we go? Up. Up. Third floor. One stairwell access, barricadable. Conference room, 2 offices, a storage room. We pre-position food, water, and medical supplies. We designate it now before we need it. Because if we need it under pressure, we won't have time. Marcus assembled the group that evening. I explained the situation without softening it. I drew the mountain's contour on a whiteboard from the conference room, marked the approach vectors, showed them the debris field on the south face and the new contacts on the east ridge. I outlined the fallback plan. 3rd floor, 1 staircase, supplies for 12 days. Diane Ostrowski raised her hand. You said contingency for breach. You mean they get inside? I mean we plan for the possibility. And if they get inside while some of us are on the ground floor and some are above? The question was precise, surgical, and it cut to the exact seam I hadn't sealed. If breach occurred while people were dispersed working in the kitchen, sleeping in 2nd floor rooms, on watch at scattered posts, consolidation to the 3rd floor would require everyone to converge through a compromised space. Some people would not make it. That's why we consolidate now, I said. Starting tonight, everyone sleeps on the 3rd floor. We work on the ground floor during daylight only, in groups, with a clear withdrawal route. Nobody argued. Day 6 was when the lodge stopped being a shelter and became a fortress, and when 23 people stopped being stranded co-workers and became a garrison. I don't know if they forgave me for that transformation. I know they survived it. Compression changes people. Not slowly. A ski lodge has a psychology built into its architecture. Open spaces encourage relaxation. High ceilings reduce anxiety. The fireplace is a social anchor. When we collapsed the living space from 3 floors to 1, from 46 rooms to 6, from a sprawling timber palace to a concrete and drywall box on the 3rd floor, the building's psychology inverted. Ceilings felt lower, walls felt closer. 23 people breathing the same recycled air, sleeping on mattresses dragged up a single staircase, sharing 2 bathrooms, eating in a conference room that smelled like powdered eggs and unwashed bodies. This was not shelter. This was confinement. Day 7 was when the group began to fracture. It started with Derek Fenn. Derek was 26, seasonal staff, a snowboard instructor in winters and a landscaper in summers, with the easy confidence of a young man whose physicality had always been his primary asset. He had been cooperative, even enthusiastic, during the barricading work. He carried furniture without complaint, took watch shifts without resistance, and held Jess Hartley together when she couldn't hold herself. But compression revealed something in Derek that open space had concealed. He needed to move. Not wanted needed, the way a caged animal needs, with a desperation that manifested as pacing, snapping, and increasingly vocal challenges to decisions he perceived as constraining. We're not prisoners, he said on the morning of day 7, standing in the conference room with his arms crossed while I briefed the watch rotation. We're sitting up here like scared animals, while those things are still 1,000 yards away. I've seen three, on the whole mountain. You blew up an entire mountainside because of 4. And now we're hiding on the top floor because of 3 more. When does this end? When do we actually do something? The room was silent. I felt 21 pairs of eyes move between Derek and me, measuring. This was not a question. This was a challenge to the authority structure, and the authority structure was me. I had 2 options: dominate or incorporate. Domination, shutting Derek down with rank, expertise, or social pressure, would end the challenge and create an enemy. Incorporation, absorbing his energy into a role that gave him agency, would cost me control of the perimeter plan, but gain me a body I needed. You're right, I said. 3 confirmed on the East Ridge, but I don't know how many are in the tree line on North and West because I don't have enough watchers. I need someone willing to go outside and do a ground-level perimeter check. Full storm gear, armed with whatever we can improvise. It's a 90-minute circuit in current conditions, and it's dangerous. I looked at him. You volunteering? The room held its breath. Derek's jaw worked. He hadn't expected agreement. He'd expected resistance, which he could push against, which would fuel the performance. I'd given him exactly what he asked for: agency, action, exposure, and now he had to decide if he actually wanted it or if the complaint was the point. Yeah, he said, I'm volunteering. He went out that afternoon with Terrence, who I sent along not as a chaperone but as structural assessment. I needed eyes on the exterior barricades from outside, checking for snow load, drift patterns against sealed doors, any structural compromise. They were gone 2 hours. They came back with useful intelligence. North face, clear. West approach, clear. East ridge. The 3 figures had not advanced significantly and appeared to be impeded by an exposed rock band above the tree line. And one piece of information that changed everything. The maintenance shed was open, not broken open. The padlock was on the ground, intact, combination dials set to the open position. Someone had accessed the shed from outside, opened the lock with the correct combination, and left. Recently, the snow accumulation inside the doorway was less than 2 hours old. We hadn't opened that shed since day 3 when we'd recovered the military cases. The padlock had been cut with bolt cutters at that time and replaced with a resort lock from Diane's supply. The resort lock was gone. A military pattern padlock was in its place. Someone had been on the mountain. Someone human. With the combination, with the equipment, with the knowledge that the shed contained pre-positioned supplies. Someone who came and went without approaching the lodge, without making contact, without leaving any sign except an unlocked door and a set of footprints already filling with snow. The owner of the contingency plan had checked on their supplies and found them missing. We had taken someone's lifeline, and that someone knew we were here. Day 8 began with Bao's voice on the improvised intercom, calm as a flight attendant announcing turbulence. Main generator fuel at 31%. At current conservation protocol, I have approximately 47 hours. We need to discuss options. 47 hours. 2 days. After that, no heat, no light, no water pumps, no powered medical equipment. The lodge would become a freezing timber box at 4,700 feet in a blizzard. And 23 people in a third-floor redoubt would begin dying not of infection, but of exposure. I gathered the core group: Marcus, Bao, Terrence, Neil, Celeste, Marin. 6 people in a storage room with the door closed, which was the first time I'd held a meeting that excluded the full group. Full transparency was a principle I'd honored for 8 days. It died that morning because the options I needed to discuss were options that would cause panic if presented without a recommendation. And I didn't have a recommendation yet. Fuel sources, I said. What do we have? Bao ticked them off. The backup generator tank 40 hours at full load. But it's the same diesel as the main, and I've already been cross-feeding. The 3 vehicles in the loading bay have a combined estimated 30 gallons of gasoline. Gasoline won't run the diesel generator without modification, and the modification would take me 6 hours and might destroy the injection system. The maintenance shed had acetylene and propane, but we used the acetylene for the charges and the propane tanks were empty as of last season. He paused. There's also the furniture. Furniture? The fireplace. It's a functional wood-burning hearth. Every piece of furniture we stripped from the unused rooms is combustible material. It won't generate electricity, but it will generate heat. If we consolidate everyone into the lobby around the fireplace, we can survive without the generator indefinitely, as long as we have things to burn. The lobby, Terrence said. Ground floor. Behind 40 feet of single-pane glass and a pile of gift shop shelving. The silence was heavy. The fireplace, the only sustainable heat source, was on the most vulnerable floor of the building, behind the weakest wall, in the space we had specifically evacuated because it was indefensible. Then we defended, Marin said. It was the first time she'd spoken in the meeting, and every head turned. She was 24, quiet, and had spent 6 days watching the mountain with the patient focus of someone trained to observe ecosystems rather than events. The glass wall faces south. The south face is buried under your avalanche debris. Nothing is coming from that direction. The east, north, and west ground floor entries are barricaded and drift sealed. The only exposure is the glass, and the glass faces the one direction that's blocked. She was right. The avalanche I'd triggered to close the road had also closed the entire south approach, and the lobby's glass curtain wall faced directly into that closed zone. It was the safest exterior wall in the building, protected not by construction, but by 20 feet of avalanche concrete. We moved down, I said. Controlled descent, core group to the lobby. Maintain the third floor as a fallback, pre-positioned and ready, but primary living space shifts to the lobby, where we can use the fireplace. Marcus nodded. Fuel conservation. We dropped the generator to critical systems, only water pumps and the radio. That stretches the 47 hours to what, Bao? If I'm running pumps 4 hours a day and the radio full time, I can get 6, maybe 7 more days. 7 days, day 15. The storm would break by then it had to. No Appalachian blizzard sustains for 2 weeks, and once the storm broke, we could assess the actual scope of the situation, potentially signal for rescue, potentially evacuate on foot over the western saddle if the valley was clear. I made the decision. We moved down. 23 people descended a single staircase carrying mattresses, food containers, water jugs, and medical supplies, converting the lobby of the Spruce Knob Mountain Resort into a fortified camp centered on a stone fireplace big enough to park a truck inside. Bao's team dismantled a queen bed frame for the first fire. The wood was dry, seasoned by years in a heated building, and thus it burned hot and clean. That first night in the lobby, with the fire roaring and the snow pressing against the glass wall in the reflected orange light, felt like something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the animal comfort of warmth and proximity and firelight. People talked, not about the crisis, about themselves. Celeste described her daughter's wedding planned for June. Terrence told a story about his first day as a lift mechanic, when he'd accidentally sent an empty chair through the bullwheel housing. Kyle played cards with 2 seasonal workers whose names I finally learned. Tomas Herrera and An Pam. I sat with my back against the stone hearth and watched the glass wall, and allowed myself, for the first time, in 8 days, to consider the possibility that we might live through this. The fire popped. Outside, the storm continued. And somewhere on the mountain, the person whose supplies we'd taken was watching the smoke rise from the chimney and making plans I couldn't see. Day 9. The Eastern Ridge contacts reached the summit. Marin saw them from the second-floor east window at dawn, not 3 anymore, but 11, having accumulated others during their traverse along the ridge. They moved onto the summit plateau in a loose, arrhythmic spread. And for the first time, I saw infected at close range. 200 yards, close enough for detail through binoculars. I will describe this once and will not describe it again. They were human in structure and inhuman in operation. Their bodies moved with a disjointed fluidity, as if the signals between brain and muscle were arriving out of sequence. A hand would clench before the arm reached for something. A head would turn seconds after the body had already changed direction. Their skin, where visible, was mottled with a bruise-colored patterning that followed vascular lines. Their eyes were open and appeared functional. They tracked movement, responded to visual stimuli, but the faces around those eyes held no expression. Not blank, not slack, simply unoccupied, the way a house looks when everyone has left but the lights are still on. Several had visible injuries that should have been incapacitating. One was missing most of the flesh from its left forearm, the bone visible and dark with cold. Another moved on a leg that bent at an angle, suggesting a compound fracture of the femur. They did not favor these injuries. They did not limp or cradle or protect. The damage existed and was irrelevant to the body's continued operation. They oriented on the lodge immediately. Not gradually immediately, as if the building's presence registered as a stimulus the moment they crested the ridge. They began moving toward it. Slowly, through deep snow, with that inexorable mechanical persistence that I was beginning to understand was the defining characteristic of the infection. They didn't hurry because they didn't need to. They didn't tire because whatever was driving them had disconnected the body's feedback systems. They simply moved, constantly, toward whatever drew them. And the only thing between 11 of them and the lobby glass wall was 200 yards of open snow. I called everyone to alert positions. Bao and Terrence reinforced the gift shop barricade against the glass wall. Neil staged trauma supplies. Marcus positioned himself at the stairwell with a fire axe, the only real weapon we had, besides the kitchen knives Celeste had distributed and the crowbars Terrence had pulled from the maintenance inventory. Derek Fenn stood at the lobby door and said, "Let me go out there." I turned. He was holding a crowbar in one hand and a length of steel chain from the lift maintenance stock in the other. And his face held an expression I recognized from accident scenes, the wild, clarified focus of a person whose fear has converted entirely into action potential. "Derek, no. There's 11 of them, and they can barely walk through that snow. I'm faster, I'm stronger, and I can reach them before they reach the building. One at a time in chest-deep powder, they're helpless. You don't know that. I know they're falling down every 20 feet. I've been watching them. They can't maintain balance in deep snow. One good hit and they're buried." The room was watching. Kyle had stopped dealing cards. Jess Hartley was gripping Anfam's hand so tightly their knuckles were white together. The fire crackled in the hearth and threw jumping shadows across the barricade. "The advisory said avoid contact with bodily fluids," I said. "You swing that crowbar into one of those things, and whatever's inside them is on you. In your eyes, your mouth, one splash." Derek looked at the crowbar, then at the glass wall, where the first of the 11 was now visible without binoculars, a shape in the snow, 150 yards out, moving with that lurching, relentless gait. "Then what's the plan, Renee? We sit here and watch them walk into the glass?" "The glass won't hold them," Terrence said quietly from behind the barricade. He was testing the brace points with his hands, reading the structure the way I read snow layers. "Single-pane commercial glass, 40 years old, thermal cycling has weakened every joint. 3 bodies hitting it at the same point it goes." "Then we're not here when it goes," I said. If they breach the glass, we go up. 3rd floor. That's what the fallback is for. And freeze. And live. Derek stared at me. The crowbar trembled in his hand. The decision to not go out, to restrain a young man whose every instinct screamed offense, was the hardest call I'd made since the avalanche. Because he wasn't wrong about their vulnerability in deep snow. And he wasn't wrong that passivity felt like dying slowly. But I had worked in mountain rescue for 7 years. And the single most important lesson that job teaches is that the rescuer who dies trying is not a hero, but a subtraction from the survival math. One lost body reduces the group's capability more than one eliminated threat improves its safety. Stand down, I said. That's not a request. He stood down. He didn't speak to me for 2 days. They reached the lodge at midday. 11 figures, spread across the south and east faces, converging on the building with the blind persistence of water finding cracks. They hit the snow-buried barricades on the east side and simply pressed against them, compacting their bodies into the gap between drift and wall with no apparent strategy, just pressure, constant and mechanical. On the south side, 4 reached the glass curtain wall and stood against it, pressing their palms flat on the surface, their mottled faces inches from the glass, those vacant, illuminated eyes staring into the lobby, where 23 people watched from behind a wall of gift shop shelving. The glass held. Terrence was right that it couldn't withstand concentrated force. But the infected were not concentrating force. They pressed individually, each one operating as a separate system. And the distributed pressure across a 40-foot surface was within the glass's tolerance. For now. Neil pulled me aside. I've been watching their behavior for 3 hours. I want to tell you what I think. We stepped into the kitchen, away from the group. Neil had his EMT's field notebook open, pages dense with observations, in a cramped handwriting that reminded me of a doctor's chart. They're not coordinating, he said. Every model of group behavior I know, herding, flocking, swarming, requires some form of information exchange between individuals. These aren't exchanging anything. They're operating on identical but independent stimulus response loops. The building is the stimulus. Approach is the response. They're not working together. They're just running the same program separately. What does that mean for us? It means they can't problem solve collectively. If one finds a way in, the others won't learn from it and replicate. But it also means they can't be distracted collectively. You can't draw them away with a single stimulus because each one is locked onto its own target independently. Can they learn individually? Neil hesitated. I don't think so. I've watched the one at the East Barricade press against the same snowdrift for 90 minutes without varying its approach. It's not trying different strategies. It's executing the same action on a loop. If the drift wasn't there, it would walk through. But it can't process the drift as an obstacle to be solved. This was useful. It meant the barricades didn't need to be impenetrable. They needed to be confusing. A barrier that presented a consistent surface without gaps or variation would hold an infected indefinitely because the infected couldn't generate alternative approaches. Our gift shop shelving wall was crude, but it was uniform. No gaps, no handles, no features that suggested a different interaction. What about deterioration? I asked. This was the question behind every calculation I'd been running since day 3. The radio traffic mentioned terminal engagement. The advisory implied this was containable. Does this thing burn out? Neil closed his notebook. I've been watching the one with the exposed forearm bone. 3 days ago, based on Marin's first sighting, it was walking on 2 functional legs. Today it's dragging the left. The tissue damage isn't just from frostbite. there's a progressive deterioration that looks metabolic. The body is consuming itself. Whatever's driving them is overriding the conservation systems that normally protect tissue from metabolic destruction. And the result is accelerated breakdown. He paused. I think they're dying, faster than they should be. The cold is accelerating it. But even in warm conditions, I think the energy expenditure of constant movement without food or rest would be unsustainable. Days, maybe, a week at most. You're guessing. I'm hypothesizing, based on observation, which is all any of us has right now. I went back to the lobby. The 4 infected at the glass wall were still pressing. Their breath fogged the glass in slow, rhythmic clouds. Behind them, the avalanche debris field was a white wall against the gray sky. The storm was thinning. I could see the tree line. For the first time in days, and beyond it, the valley floor, where columns of smoke rose from places that shouldn't have been burning. Jess Hartley was sitting in a chair by the fire, watching the infected through the glass. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried since day 4. Her face held the expression of someone who had passed through fear into a territory beyond it. Not courage, not numbness, but a kind of focused acceptance that I recognized from patients in the field who have assessed their own injury and decided to participate in their rescue, rather than merely endure it. "Renee," she said, not looking away from the glass. "Can I help?" "What can you do?" "I worked rental counter. I know every piece of equipment in the ski shop downstairs: boots, poles, helmets, bindings. The ski poles are aluminum shafts with hardened steel tips. There's about 160 of them in the rental racks." I looked at her. She looked at me. She was 22 and she was describing weapons, and neither of us pretended she was describing anything else. "Show me," I said. Day 10. The storm broke. Not gradually. The Appalachian weather system that had pinned us to the summit for over a week exhausted itself between midnight and dawn, the wind dropping from sustained 40 to a whisper, the clouds fracturing and pulling apart like cotton. And by 7 in the morning, for the first time in 8 days, the sun hit Spruce Knob. The beauty was obscene. I stood on the south deck. The infected on the glass wall had collapsed overnight, their bodies motionless in the snow below the windows. And Neil's hypothesis received its first confirmation, and looked out over a landscape so white and vast and crystalline that it hurt. The valley floor was visible from summit to horizon. The Allegheny ridgeline marched north and south in serrated perfection. Every tree below the tree line was a white sculpture, every rock a white monument. And the sky was the depthless blue that only exists at altitude after a storm. A blue so saturated it verged on violet. From that deck, in that light, I could see everything. And everything was wrong. Smoke from at least 12 points in the valley. No vehicle movement on any visible road. A dark smear on the snow along Route 33 that I identified through binoculars as a line of abandoned cars stretching for miles. And on the slopes below us, not just the south face, not just the east ridge, but everywhere, on every approach, figures. Scattered. Dozens. Moving uphill through snow that was now consolidating in the sunlight, firming under their feet, making their passage faster. I counted for 30 minutes. Marin counted with me. We compared numbers. 87 confirmed visual contacts on the mountain. 87. Kyle was at the north window. His count added 31 from the north face. Marin's west count added 19. 137 infected on the mountain, converging on the summit from every direction, moving faster now that the snow had a crust. I put down the binoculars and looked at Marcus. He was standing behind me on the deck, and his face had finally broken not into panic, not into despair, but into the terrible clarity of a man who understood that every plan, every barricade, every conservation protocol and fallback position and full transparency meeting had been predicated on a scale of threat that was off by an order of magnitude. "The ones at the glass," I said. Neil was right. They collapsed. They deteriorated and stopped. But there are 137 more coming, and some of them are fresh. The valley is still producing them. How long until they reach us? Fastest movers, 4 to 6 hours. The snow crust will support weight until afternoon, when solar heating softens it. After that, they'll punch through and slow down again. But by then, the first wave will already be here. Marin spoke from the west window, her voice carrying that flat, observational tone I'd come to rely on. The west approach over the saddle is the gentlest grade. If I'm reading the movement patterns correctly, the largest concentration is coming from that direction, maybe 60 of the 137. I closed my eyes. 60 from the west. The west approach led directly to the loading bay behind the kitchen. The loading bay had a roll-up door steel, but designed for delivery trucks, not siege. If 60 bodies pressed against it with the same mindless persistence as the 4 who'd pressed the glass, the door would fail. The door would fail, and they would be in the kitchen, and the kitchen connected to the lobby. And the lobby was where 23 people were sleeping around a fireplace because the generator was dying, and the 3rd floor was a freezer. I opened my eyes. The mountain was bright and silent and full of death walking uphill in the sunshine. "We can't hold the ground floor," I said. Marcus looked at me. "The fireplace." "I know." "We go back upstairs, we freeze." "I know." "So what do we do?" This was the moment. I want you to understand this was the moment everything turned, not because of a discovery or a revelation or a radio transmission, but because of a piece of terrain I had looked at every day for 7 years without seeing what it actually was. The backside bowls, the west-facing slopes below the summit ridge, where intermediate skiers carved turns in January and wildflowers grew in July. Below those bowls, at the base of the west face, was the saddle, the low point between Spruce Knob and the adjacent ridge. And on the far side of that saddle, on the adjacent ridge, was a fire lookout tower. I'd skied past it 100 times. Forest Service tower, 1960s vintage, steel frame, 60 feet tall, with a cab on top, a 7x7 glass and steel box, designed to give a single ranger a 360-degree view of the forest canopy. It was decommissioned, locked, abandoned. But it was 60 feet in the air, accessible only by a steel staircase with removable sections. And it was on the opposite side of the saddle from the primary wave of infected approaching from the west. "We go up," I said. "Not upstairs, up the mountain, over the ridge, down to the saddle, across and up the fire tower." Marcus stared at me. "It's 60 feet above ground, steel frame, one access point. We pull the stair sections behind us and nothing reaches us. It's open to weather, but the storm is over and daytime temperatures will be survivable. We take blankets, food, the radio, medical supplies. We carry everything on our backs across the saddle. That's 1.5 miles in deep snow. On snowshoes. There are 64 pairs in the rental shop, with 137 of those things on the mountain, concentrated on the west approach below the saddle. If we leave now, before the crust softens, we cross the ridge and descend to the tower before the west wave clears the saddle. They're coming to the lodge. The lodge is the stimulus. We leave the lodge, we leave the stimulus. And if they follow us? 60 feet of steel, removable stairs. They can't climb. Neil says they can't problem solve. They'll stand at the base until they decay. The plan was insane. The plan was the only plan. 23 people on snowshoes, crossing an exposed mountain ridge in post-blizzard conditions, racing a wave of infected to a decommissioned fire tower. It was the kind of operation I would have rejected in any professional risk assessment, the kind of thing that gets patrollers fired and rescuers killed. But staying was death. The math was clear, and I was the only person on that mountain who could lead 23 people across that terrain. We leave in 1 hour, I said. Everyone carries, no exceptions. I have led evacuations. Injured skiers on backboards through whiteout conditions. Hypothermic teenagers on sleds down icy fire roads. A cardiac arrest victim on a snowmobile, through a blizzard to a waiting helicopter. None of those prepared me for leading 23 people across the summit ridge of Spruce Knob, with 137 infected converging from below. We geared up in 40 minutes. Jess Hartley and Thomas Herrera distributed the ski poles she'd identified. Each person got 2. Aluminum shafts with steel tips, the best improvised weapon available. Celeste and Ann packed food into every available backpack and pillowcase. Neil organized medical supplies into 2 kits, one on his back, one on Kyle's. Bao drained the remaining generator fuel into portable containers for potential fire use. Marin loaded the field radio and batteries into a frame pack. Marcus carried the fire axe, 64 pairs of rental snowshoes, 23 people. I fitted everyone personally, adjusting bindings to boot sizes, demonstrating the stride to those who'd never worn them. Most hadn't. The seasonal workers were young, fit, and terrified. Diane Ostrowski was 52 with a bad knee. A maintenance worker named Harold Sung was 61, with a cardiovascular reserve of a lifelong smoker. These were the links that would determine our pace, which would determine our margin, which would determine who lived. I addressed the group in the lobby for the last time. The fire was still burning. The 4 collapsed infected lay in the snow outside the glass wall, motionless, their bodies already disappearing under the fresh layer of snow that had blown off the roof in the night. Beyond them, the avalanche debris field gleamed in the sun. We're going to cross the summit ridge heading west, descend to the saddle, and climb the fire lookout tower on the adjacent peak. Distance is approximately 1.5 miles. On snowshoes, in current snow conditions, I estimate 90 minutes for the group. We move in a single column. I lead. Marcus anchors. Nobody stops. Nobody falls behind. Nobody leaves the column for any reason. If you see infected, you do not engage. You keep moving. They are slower than us in snow. That is our only advantage, and we do not surrender it. I looked at Derek Fenn. He was in the middle of the group, crowbar strapped to his pack, Jess Hartley beside him. He met my eyes and nodded. Whatever anger he carried toward me had been burned clean by the mathematics of 137. Stay close, I said. Stay quiet. Stay together. We left through the kitchen service entrance at 8:40 in the morning, stepping out of the building that had been our world for 9 days, into sunlight so bright it was an assault. The snow surface was firm. The overnight refreeze had created a crust that supported our snowshoes without breakthrough. And we moved across the summit plateau at a pace I estimated at 2 miles per hour. Fast. Faster than I'd hoped. The ridge crossing was the most exposed section 300 yards along the spine of the mountain, with drop-offs on both sides and no cover from wind or observation. I led the column in a traverse that stayed just below the ridgeline on the lee side. using the crest itself as visual cover from the west approach below. It worked. As we crested and began the descent toward the saddle, I looked back and saw the lodge receding behind us, already looking small, already looking like something that belonged to a different version of reality. Below us, to the west, I could see the saddle, a broad, gentle depression between the two peaks, maybe 200 yards across, buried in deep, unblemished snow. Beyond it, the adjacent ridge rose steeply, and on its summit, silhouetted against the blue sky, the fire lookout tower stood on its steel legs like a sentinel. I could also see the infected. The West Wave Marin 60 was on the lower slopes below the saddle, still 1,000 vertical feet below us, moving uphill through timber. They were not on the saddle itself. The path was clear. "Move," I said, and 23 people on snowshoes began the descent. The snow in the saddle was different from the summit, deeper, less wind-compacted, and the crust was thinner. Harold Sung broke through on his third step and went to his waist. Terence pulled him out. He broke through again 10 steps later. Diane Ostrowski's bad knee buckled on the uneven surface, and she went down hard, crying out before she could muffle it. Sound carries in post-storm mountain air. The cry bounced off the rock faces on both sides of the saddle and rolled downhill toward the tree line, where 60 infected were climbing. I don't know if they heard it. I know that within minutes of that sound, 3 figures at the leading edge of the west wave changed direction. They had been moving northeast toward the lodge. Now they were moving north toward the saddle, toward us. I saw them change course. Marin saw it too. She said nothing, just touched my arm and pointed, and I understood that the stimulus model Neil had described was more flexible than we'd assumed. The lodge was the primary attractor, but sound at close range could override it. We were no longer invisible. "Double time," I said. Not a shout. A command delivered in the flat tone I used on the mountain when a patient was coding and the helicopter was 2 minutes out. The voice that says, "There is no time for fear. Move." The column accelerated. The saddle crossing was 300 yards. We'd covered 100. The 3 redirected infected were below and south, maybe 800 yards out, moving through timber at a pace I estimated against our own. The math was tight. Not impossible. Tight. Kyle Ostrowski moved to his mother's side and took her arm without being asked. Diane leaned on him and found a rhythm step plant that kept her upright and moving. Harold Sung was gasping, his face the color of old brick, but Bao was beside him, matching pace. Carrieris was touring Harold's pack in addition to his own. We reached the far side of the saddle. The fire tower rose above us, steel legs planted in a rock outcrop, the staircase zigzagging up the frame in 7 flights. The bottom flight had a padlocked Gate Forest Service anti-trespass measure. Terence hit the padlock with his crowbar once, twice, and it sheared on the 3rd strike. "Up," I said. "Single file. Hold the rails. Do not stop on the landings." 23 people climbed a 60-foot steel staircase in snowshoes and winter gear, carrying everything they'd salvaged from a ski lodge. The staircase was not designed for this. It was designed for one ranger with a lunch pail. The steel sang and shivered under the collective weight, and I stood at the base counting bodies as they passed. 1, 2, 3, Jess, Derek, Kyle with Diane, Bao with Harold, Celeste, Neil, Thomas, Ang, Marin. The 3 redirected infected cleared the tree line at the southern edge of the saddle. I could see them clearly now, 500 yards, moving through the open snow of the saddle floor, heading directly for the tower. Behind them, more shapes emerged from the timber. Not 3, not 6. The sound of the climb boots on steel, packs scraping railings. Harold's coughing was pulling them in like a signal fire. 15. Marcus was at the first landing, looking down at me. 16, 17, I counted. The infected were 300 yards out. 20, 21, 22. Marcus descended to the base. "You're 23. Go." I went up. Marcus came behind me. At the first landing, I stopped and turned. "Stair pins," I said. Each flight was bolted to the frame with removable pins at the connection point standard fire tower design, allowing sections to be lifted out for maintenance. Marcus understood immediately. Terrence, 2 flights up, understood before either of us spoke. He was already pulling the pin on flight 3, and the section dropped 6 inches before the safety catch held it, designed to be removable, but not to fall. He kicked the safety catch. The section swung free, hanging by one connection point, creating a 12-foot gap in the staircase. We pulled 3 sections, flights 1, 3, and 5. Each removal created a gap no body could cross without a ladder or a 12-foot vertical leap. The removed sections we hauled up and laid across the upper framework as additional platform space. The first infected reached the base of the tower as I climbed the last flight into the cab. It stood at the bottom of the truncated staircase flight. One was gone. The lowest remaining step was 12 feet above ground and looked up. Its eyes tracked the structure. Its hands reached for steel that wasn't there. Then it pressed its body against the tower leg and began pushing, the same way its counterparts had pushed against the glass wall, with that mindless, undifferentiated pressure that knew no strategy and accepted no obstacle. The tower didn't move. It was anchored in rock, welded to a concrete footing designed to withstand 100-mile-per-hour winds at 60 feet. One body against it was nothing. 10 bodies would be nothing. The structure was indifferent to anything that couldn't climb. 23 people stood in and on the fire lookout tower, 12 in the cab, 11 on the platform and upper stair sections we'd repurposed, and looked down at the growing cluster of infected at the base. 20, 30. More arriving from the saddle, drawn by the sound, the presence, whatever signaled the living broadcast to the dead-eyed things that hunted them. They gathered. They pressed. They could not reach us. I sat on the cold steel platform with my back against the cab wall and my legs hanging over 60 feet of empty air. And I watched the mountain I'd spent 7 years protecting try to deliver us to something I still didn't fully understand. The lodge was visible on the adjacent summit, small, distant, already surrounded by dark shapes pressing against its walls. The thing I'd built our survival around for 9 days was being overrun, and we weren't in it. Marin sat beside me. "How long?" "Neil says they're deteriorating. Days, maybe a week." "And us?" I inventoried mentally. Food for 2 weeks at reduced rations. Snow melt for water. No heat except body proximity and chemical warmers. Exposure was the threat now, not infection, not siege, but cold, wind, and the physiological limits of human bodies in an open-air structure at 4,500 feet in late winter. "We hold," I said. "We hold, and they don't." We held for 5 days. 5 days in a 7x7 glass cab and a steel platform at 60 feet, with no heat, no privacy, no room to lie flat, and a congregation of infected standing at the base that peaked at over 200 before it began to thin. I will not romanticize those days. They were brutal. Harold Sung developed pneumonia on day 2 in the tower, day 11 overall. And Neil kept him alive with the military antibiotics and the collective body heat of 6 people pressing against him in the cab through the night. Diane's knee swelled to twice its size. A seasonal worker named Paul Renner, whose name I hadn't learned until the tower because he'd been quiet through the entire crisis, developed frostbite on 3 toes that Neil later amputated with a surgical kit and a steadiness I will never forget. But we held, and they didn't. Neil's hypothesis proved correct on a timeline slightly longer than his estimate. The infected at the tower base began collapsing on day 12. One by one at first, then in clusters, their bodies folding onto the snow with the mechanical finality of machines whose power supply had been severed. They didn't convulse. They didn't cry out. They simply stopped mid-stride, mid-press, mid-reach, and went down. And the bodies that were already down didn't get up. By day 14, the base of the tower was a field of motionless forms, half buried in snow. By day 15, nothing moved on the mountain that I could see from any direction. The lodge stood silent on the adjacent summit. Its glass walls shattered in 3 places, its dark interior visible through the gaps, empty of the shapes that had pressed against it. On day 15, Bao powered up the field radio on its last battery charge. The frequencies that had carried military coordination were now carrying something different: civilian emergency broadcasts, FEMA channel identifiers, coordinates for distribution points, and medical stations in the Greenbrier Valley. The language had changed. Terminal engagement had become relief coordination. Corridor clearance had become search and rescue. I listened to a voice say, "All mountain and highland areas in the Eastern Theater are cleared for descent." Repeat. Pathogen life cycle confirmed at 18 to 22 days from onset. All active vectors in exposed populations are past terminal metabolic threshold. Highland survivors should proceed to valley staging areas for registration and medical assessment. 18 to 22 days. The pathogen consumed its hosts in under 3 weeks. We had been on the mountain for 15 days. The timeline fit. The collapsed bodies at the tower base were not sleeping or dormant. They were finished, burned out from the inside by a biological process that demanded more from the human body than the human body could sustain. I climbed down first, alone. I replaced the stair sections, descended to the ground, and walked among the fallen infected with a ski pole in each hand, and my heart hammering against my sternum. None moved. The closest one to the stair base, the first to arrive, the one who had pressed against the tower leg, lay face up in the snow. Its eyes were open, clouded, ice-crystalled. Its expression, in death, had resolved into something that looked like exhaustion. Not peace, not horror. Just the final settled state of a body that had been driven past every limit and had nothing left. I climbed back up. "It's clear," I said. 23 people descended. 23. The number I'd asked you to hold. Every one of them. Harold on a makeshift stretcher, Diane leaning on Kyle, Paul Renner limping on bandaged feet, Jess Hartley holding a ski pole like she'd been born with it. Derek Fenn, who hadn't spoken to me in 4 days, looked at me at the bottom of the staircase and said, "I would have died out there on day 9 if you'd let me go." "I know. Thank you. Don't." We crossed the saddle. We passed the lodge without entering. I couldn't look at it, couldn't process the shattered glass and the dark shapes inside that had once been a building I loved. We descended the access road, which the sun had been softening for days, making passage possible if exhausting. At Cutter's Bridge, the jackknife truck was still there, but the snow around it had been plowed by military vehicles. The bridge was clear. A National Guard convoy found us 2 miles below the bridge. 12 vehicles, medical personnel, blankets and IV fluids, and the stunned faces of soldiers who had been clearing bodies for 2 weeks and did not expect to find 23 living people walking down a mountain road in snowshoes. I gave my name. I gave the count. 23 up, 23 down. The sergeant in charge looked at me with an expression I didn't understand until later. It was disbelief, not at our survival at the number. In the Eastern Theater, he told me, the average survival rate for isolated groups above 3,000 feet was 40%. Most groups lost people to cold, to infection, to internal violence, to despair. 23 out of 23 was not a number he had encountered. I didn't explain. I couldn't. The explanation was 9 days in a ski lodge and 5 days on a steel tower and an avalanche I triggered at 4 in the morning, and a 17-year-old kid who watched the north window without being asked, and a kid from the rental counter who saw ski poles as spears, and a man who wanted to fight, and a woman who knew how to watch, and a maintenance worker who bled from his hands pulling stair pins in the cold, and a paramedic who amputated toes with a steady hand, and a manager who chose transparency every single time, and a cook who rationed with precision, and a group of strangers who carried each other across a mountain because the alternative was to sit still and be consumed. 23. I held that number in my chest like a second heartbeat all the way down the mountain. They gave us blankets at the staging area in Franklin, hot coffee, cots in a gymnasium. A doctor checked Harold, stabilized him, airlifted him to a hospital in Staunton. Paul Renner lost the 3 toes, but kept his foot. Diane's knee would need surgery she'd get 6 months later. Everyone else walked out with frostbite, exhaustion, and a psychological architecture that would take years to process or never fully would. I returned to Spruce Knob once, in July. The lodge was condemned structural damage from the siege, water infiltration through the shattered glass wall, black mold colonizing the lobby where we'd burned furniture and slept on mattresses and watched dead-eyed faces press against the windows. The fire tower still stood. It will stand for decades. Steel and concrete don't care what happened on them. I didn't go up. I stood at the base and looked at the snow-free ground where 200 bodies had lain, and saw only wildflowers, purple aster, goldenrod, the ordinary vegetation of an Appalachian summer reclaiming the space. The mountain had absorbed it all. The mountain does not carry what we carry. I carry 23, not as weight, as proof that the woman who blew the mountainside open at 4 in the morning and refused to let a brave kid die fighting and drag 22 people across a frozen saddle to a 60-foot steel tower was enough. Not more than enough, exactly enough. The mountain taught me that precision. I will not waste it.